If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back. I'm excited. 3-2 Battalion, 2 Recce, 5 Recce, Signals Officer. Probably from a Signal Corps, I suppose. I'm translating from Afrikaans if I'm wrong. It's Justin Taylor. Justin, if I'm wrong, I apologize. But we had you on before. We had you at the Battle of Sabati, the Day of Sabati, which is coming up now, 22 May of 2022. I'm invited. I will do my best to actually arrive for the church service. Thank you, Rick Lopp. I'm really grateful. I might even wear my police beret and my few medals I actually have. But Justin, we're here to talk about you today. We also spoke about your book, Whispering the Reeds. I would urge everybody to go and listen to these videos. But Justin was kind enough to say to me that he will talk to us about his career in the army, his camps, his time at 3-2 Battalion, as well as being trained as a signal officer. So it's over to you. Welcome here. Thank you once again for your time. May I ask you, where do you come from? What happened to you? I know you're a liberal man. You speak a bit of Zulu as well. Grew up on a farm, but the army grabbed you nonetheless.
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much again for having me and your interest. Yeah, I grew up on a farm on a sugar farm in Zululand. Yeah, just to give a background as to how we ended up in the military. As a white guy in South Africa, by the time we all left school, we were all drafted into the military. But just taking it a step back, and hopefully it'll help understand how I ended up in 3-2, growing up on a farm. Fantastic upbringing. I was always riding horses, out fishing, hunting, and it was an amazing privilege to grow up on that farm and out in the wilderness. And yeah, I've mentioned it before. You mentioned that I'm a liberal guy. Yeah, I grew up before I sent off to boarding school at 8 years old. My three best mates were 3 black guys on the farm. My nursemaids was a Zulu woman, and so no surprise that I learned as a kid to speak Zulu before I could speak English. And yeah, those were golden days out on the farm there, and that sense of adventure and freedom, which was very hard for me to face being sent to boarding school. Not quite like being sent to prison, but it was very restrictive. So yeah, I've 10 years of boarding school and good schools in South Africa as well. Drafted into the military as you all were. I was hoping to get drafted into the infantry. I wanted to be a platoon commander. And what, for me, the sort of dark humor, I suppose, or the joke of it was that most of the other guys in my class, when they were filling out the forms as to what they're interested in the military, they all were filling out glamorous things like the Navy or Air Force or artillery or armor. And I was the only guy that filled out artillery. And the big surprise is that out of all of us, they were all sent to infantry and I got sent to signals. So I'm not sure how the military logic works there, but yeah, so I got to the Army Gymnasium in Heidelberg, just outside Johannesburg on the Highveld in South Africa, and to do my basic training. And that was a very interesting process. 30 of us in a platoon from all walks of life, all very individual people, as you were, being civilian. And the process that took us through was very interesting in terms of basically stripping us of our identity, putting us in a uniform, all exactly the same, heads shaped pretty much as I am today. And then they've started the process with the basic training of really hammering us, putting us under a lot of pressure to break us down physically and mentally, and to a certain point emotionally as well, with the express purpose of once they got us realizing that we weren't the center of the universe as individuals, they started bringing us up as a team. And I think that's the biggest thing that I really appreciated my training with the military was they taught us to either all 30 of us came back or none of us came back. And that was, that stood me in very good stead for the rest of my life. So that was very interesting. And the other interesting thing with the basic training, when I arrived in the army, I could hardly speak a word of Afrikaans. And so I'm not sure how I passed my school Afrikaans, but the theory, but I did. And so as an English-speaking South African, I got hammered quite simply because I didn't understand what they were telling me. And I mean, the corporal would come up to me and scream, or scream at all of us, "Hardloop rondom die boom." And so, of course, everybody in the platoon dashes off, and I'm standing there trying to work out what this is that he's told us. And I'm thinking, hardloop, I don't know that one. I'll come back to that. Rondom, sure, that's a difficult one. Boom, well, that's what the guys smoke in Durban. But I'm not sure what that's got to do with us here. And by that stage, the corporal's got his nose against my nose and is screaming obscenities at me because of my perceived belligerence or whatever, just the fact that I wasn't listening to him. And so I very quickly learned Afrikaans and very quickly became one of the fittest guys in the platoon, because I was always in trouble, because I was always hesitating, not knowing quite what they were telling us. So that was an interesting process to go through. So yeah, basics was hard. Our particular corporal was very tough on us, Corporal Muntz. If I ever, I'd love to meet him again sometime and shake his hand and thank him for what he put us through, because when other platoons were back in the barracks, he still had us out there going through the mud and the barbed wire of the obstacle course, or sending us back over the hill. And we muttered and cursed at the time, but he was very hard, but very firm and very fair. And yeah, and I think he also taught us never to give up. And where, I suppose, a combat application there is if you build a bunker and you walk away and the shell lands in it and destroys it, you can't throw a tantrum and say, well, I'm not going to build that bunker again, because no matter how many times it gets destroyed, you just got to do it again and again and again and never give up. And that was the other big thing that Corporal Muntz taught us. So if he's out there, yeah, I'd like to thank him. So I would love to meet him again. So that was basic training. And out of that, they selected those of us for junior leadership course. I was fortunate to get onto that. We did the junior leadership in a camp outside of the Army Gymnasium, tented camp out in the veld there. And that was a long, hard 6 months. We had to run about 5Ks into the main base every day and run back. So we got very, very fit. And there was a combination of leadership skills and the signals. The signals theory, very, very theoretical, which was for me really put me in a tight spot when I got up to the border in 3-2, way too theoretical. And when I think back, this was hindsight's a perfect science, but they should have thrown us out into the bush for at least 3 weeks on our own, or with just two of us, and left us to make communication or not get fed, sort of thing. But they certainly gave us all the theory that we needed, and leadership. as well. There was a fascinating combination for me when I look back on it, of almost well, I suppose it was a combination of British Army discipline and the Boer way of guerrilla fighting and living to fight another day. In fact, that was the one thing when they said to us quite soon into the training, we don't want you to die for your country, we'd like you to live for your country. And I can remember thinking at the time that was a very good idea. So I certainly bought into that one. Yeah, so that's end of junior leadership. Those of us selected for officers course, we moved back into the Army Gymnasium, and that was great because we, as candidate officers, we were housed in the officers' mess and had a decent bed to sleep in. We ate in the officers' mess with proper cutlery. So it was a huge change from out in the veld in the tents to the officers' mess. And the other interesting thing was that the subtle change with the NCOs, because up to that, for the first, what was that, sort of nearly 9 months, we had to run everywhere. They were always screaming at us and always looking to jump on you. Well, not physically, but yeah, get on your case. And suddenly now we were candidate officers. I could see they were already sort of hedging their bets because they realized that if we passed the officers course, we would be their superior. So that was interesting. Yeah, officers course was good. Very relaxed after the first part of the training. Yeah, just the one thing also which struck me with the South African Army was that they weren't able to physically, any instructors were not able to physically touch you. In fact, if they pointed at you with their one finger like that, that was construed as an intent to assault, and they would get court-martialed. And so that's why they always pointed with 4 fingers. But that was one aspect of the training and their whole approach to training that I had such huge respect for, because they were able to scream at you. They could push you to your physical limits and mental limits, but there was no physical contact, which, yeah, made it very positive and very constructive. And there was that enabled a respect amongst us. Yeah, see in some movies whether it's true or not, but guys getting physically taken on by their army instructors, and that was not the case in the South African Army. So yeah, graduated as a second lieutenant at the end of 1979, and then we had to choose where, or apply for where we wanted to go. And there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I wanted to go up to the border, Namibia, or Southwest Africa back then, the border between Southwest Africa, Namibia, and Angola. Quite simply because of the open spaces up there, the wilderness, having grown up on a farm, yeah, the thought of being sent to a regular army battalion filled me with dread. In fact, I think I'd have died a death of a million screams. So there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that that's where I wanted to go. And interestingly, I think, if I remember, I'm guessing a bit, but if they needed 15 officers and NCOs in the operational area in the border, only about 6, 7 of us volunteered. So they had to volunteer the, in inverted commas, the balance. Yeah, we were sent off on 2 weeks leave, which is great. And then we reported to Waterkloof Air Base in Pretoria with our kit. And I can remember sitting there on the apron on my kit, our balsac and that sort of thing. We had a couple of hours sitting out there, yeah, that gave us time to sort of reflect on what we were letting ourselves in for, going up into the operational area. As signals officers and NCOs, it was highly unlikely we'd get involved in actual combat. But there's no doubt we had quite a responsibility on our shoulders with regard to making sure that the battalion or whoever we were, battalion or brigade at divisional level, that the communication was there, which is for me the absolute key to being able to effectively coordinate any military organization. So it was an interesting time of quiet reflection and taking a deep breath as well before we set out on this hell of an adventure, which it turned out to be. So that was our training, and yeah, the background to how I arrived up in the operational area in a place called Grootfontein, which was the big, huge army base logistical army base, sort of on the southern end of the operational area, but northern end of Namibia, obviously. And from there, we were going to get posted to whichever military units we were going to be with for the rest of the sort of 13, 14 months. So that's the training. Are there any questions your side, Chris?
Yes, I've been making a few notes as always. Let me start by a rumor I've heard. I don't know if this is true, but some of the soldiers have been telling me that they were in a scuttlebutt rumors of snakes there on the border area, which has as big as man-made big, and they have a head as big as a dog. They were telling these stories, of course. But now I need to know from you. In the sugarcane fields, I've heard the same story, that there might be snakes in the sugarcane fields as big as nothing you've ever seen before. And they can, grab the poor worker who's cutting there with his ponga, they can grab him. Is that true, since you grew up on a farm like that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I don't think the snakes are quite as big as you've said these guys make out, other than maybe the pythons. But back in Zululand, how I and my two brothers and I didn't get bitten by a snake or taken by a crocodile, I do not know. I think the universe was on our side with that one. I did get spat in the eyes of the spitting cobra. I did stand on a snake's head in a tree as a kid. Never climbed out of a tree as quick as that. My brother and our black mates as well, they never seen them get out of a tree as fast either. So, but up on the border, clearly there were snakes, but it wasn't that much of a threat. I can't remember seeing a snake on the border, because it wasn't, unless you're close to the rivers and the thick bush next to the rivers, sure, a lot of snakes. The rest of the terrain in Namibia was very flat, very sandy, with sparse trees. So not particularly healthy for a snake. I mean, because it'd be very exposed. So yeah, snakes, they were there, and sure, a guy got bitten, but and definitely not with heads as big as this. I'm sure of that. I think
the stories which they tell in the old days. But before you got onto that C-150, the Flossie, the Hercules, have you ever been on an aircraft before? Because I had some chaps here telling me they've never left South Africa before they flew to the border area, which is a different country, and they've never been on an aircraft before. Is that the same with you, or?
No, I had been on an aircraft, nothing like the Flossie, as we call it, the Hercules transport planes. I'd been on light aircraft, and might even have been on an airliner. but yeah, just as my grandfather was a fighter pilot in World War One, and my father was a Spitfire pilot in World War Two. So at any opportunity growing up, I was always jumping on into a light aircraft and going along for the ride. So yeah, no, aircraft would, I had definitely been on that, so that wasn't a surprise.
But okay, now you arrive there at on the border. You're an officer now, but being an officer has great responsibilities. And did you feel you could manage this? Did you feel you're up to the task?
Yeah, I think our training had got us to the point where we'd worked hard to get there. We'd been through the selection process. And as a second lieutenant, it was for me quite an honor to be awarded that rank. And what I liked about it and why I set out to become an officer is that you more involved in the planning, and yeah, the way I saw it, officers do the thinking and the strategic planning, and the NCOs are the guys who do the day-to-day implementation and the discipline. And that suited me. And while, yeah, certainly parts of it was quite intimidating, I was cautiously optimistic that I'd be able to handle it, and I look forward to it as a second lieutenant. In fact, I was saying to someone the other day is that to my mind, the best rank in the military is to be a second lieutenant. It was fantastic. You had the status as an officer, but you were too junior to have too much on your shoulders. So it was really good.
Well, I often, when you look at Hollywood movies, you often see the officer getting extremely annoyed because there's no comms. Then he starts kicking the radio, but in the meantime, he's shouting you down the radio as well. It's very dramatic. But is that based upon reality?
Yeah, very much so. I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but when I first arrived at 3-2 Battalion, after a month and a bit, Commandant Ferreira called me in, briefed me on the fact that we were, as a battalion, we're going to attack an Angolan army base, a base called Dirico, just the other side of the Kavanga River, down towards the Caprivi. And which at the time for me was, I walked out of that briefing in a bit of a daze. The fact that Yara was actively planning to take on and annihilate up to 400 people, just the reality of being a soldier sort of hit in. And but once I'd got over that, I did my planning and the signals orders, and the OC with all the radio nets, who was talking to who and what radios would be used at what level, etc., as you were taught back at Heidelberg, and the signals training. The OC signed them off. So everything looked good on paper. And we flew down from Rindu down to Buffalo Base, from where we were trooped up to the kickoff point, this side of the river. We were going to cross the river in assault boats to attack Durka. And so everything went off very well until we were sitting in the bush. To sort of midnight, the 3 frequencies I'd been given by brigade headquarters, with my own experience, I thought they would have been tested and there was nothing wrong with them. But because of the frequencies, they were unsuitable for that time of day and that terrain and that distance. And yeah, going into midnight, waiting to board the assault boats to go across the river, we had a comms failure. There was, the HF comms weren't working. VHF was fine. And I got a message in the dark that Commandant Ferreira wanted to see me. So I didn't know what it was about at the time. So I found my way from sort of one group to the next in the bush to Ferreira, who was sitting quietly under some small low-lying trees with a couple of the senior officers there, and he said to me that he said, yeah, seiner, and to use the term seiner, which is singular in Afrikaans, but the way it was said for me was always almost an insult. And he said, normally call me Justin, and he said, seiner, if you don't get comms the next half an hour, I'm throwing you out the battalion. And that was in front of all these senior officers there. So I slunk off into the dark, not knowing where to even start. And I tried everything with the radio. Checked everything, the antennas, the batteries, the handset connections, and I couldn't get comms. Eventually, sort of, but like Donald Duck, sort of came through. You could just make out what they were saying. But anyway, luckily the attack was called off literally half an hour before we were getting in the salt boats. So I was left there on the banks with the Chief Staff Intelligence guys who were the UNITA guerrillas liaison with us. And we were there about 5-6 days. While Willem Rutte and I think Rick Glob was with that group while they mined and blew up the bridge at Jericho. And then after that, I was trooped back to Rundu, which is where the HQ and Covenant Ferreira was. Made myself very scarce and disappeared out of there to the west, to the Recce base on my own to give myself some retraining. And the key with that I worked out, I pulled out all my theory books again, and with the Recce guys, they were fantastic. I worked out a more practical approach, and the key issue, quite simply, was with the frequencies, especially, HF frequencies. You've got the ionosphere above the Earth, which is pretty much, the way I understand it, what's what protects us from outer space. And the ionosphere with the Earth, with the sunshine, it expands when the sun comes up and the air, and then it comes down at night as the air cools. And that affects your HF communication, because HF radio waves bounce off the ionosphere and back down to Earth. You do get some what we call ground wave, which goes along the surface of the Earth, and that in turn is affected by the water level. So there are a lot of variables which you don't have control over there. But the key thing with the ionosphere was, as it got dark and the Earth cooled, I worked out that you have to come down in frequency, and sort of from midnight through 2-3 in the morning, you'd be down at 2.5 megahertz. And even then, a lot of interference and crackling, and the most difficult time was that hour just before and as the sun was coming up, when the ionosphere started moving quickly back up. Now the Earth is where you are is starting to warm up, and then as the day wore on and got warmer, so we would switch to you'd have to go up to 5 megahertz, 6, 7, 8 megahertz. And middle of the day at 8 megs, the distance we were working was crystal clear. So the key with it all, as I had to work out for myself, the hard way, as it were, was before any ops, the frequencies I was assigned by brigade, I would test over a 24-hour period, literally every 15 minutes, and 24 hours, wouldn't sleep, and I'd test over 200-300 kilometers, and work out which frequencies would work best at what time of day, and I'd come up with a table. So that was a long way of saying, I suppose, having an officer getting upset about no comms, I very nearly got thrown out of the battalion because of that. And but managed to squirm my way past the OC out to Amaoni, retrain myself with the help of the Recce guys. And then, after about 3-4 weeks, the OC arrived in a Puma helicopter. And as it landed, I sort of took a deep breath and sort of swallowed a bit, and walked out to face my fate. I thought maybe he's coming to say, I've been looking for you you need to go head south, RTU. And he stopped and looked me in the eyes and said, yeah, you've retrained yourself. And I said, yes, Commandant. And he said, that's good, because you're coming with me to the west on another op. So that's when I knew I'd been given a reprieve. And so that was the one time. The other time, and again, skipping way ahead, going into Savati, we were in the Biffle command Biffle, and yeah, by then that was sort of mid-year, and I'd learned I used to test and check everything. I'd check it 5 times over, every radio, every handset, make sure it was working. So going in, we lost comms with the convoy going in to Savati got lost. There's a whole story with that. So we had to get the spotter plane to help us, which at the time it was usually a Bosbok, those 2-seaters, one behind each other, spotter plane. In this instance, we had a Cessna 185, and we couldn't get comms with the guy. We could see him above us and hear him, and the OC was standing in the biffle with trying to call him, and Telstar, this is 0 Alpha or whatever. And nothing. And he looked at me like this, and I could see what was coming. So I took his VHF radio and I walked 500 meters away, checked that it worked with another VHF radio, and the command vehicle came back and said, Commandant, this thing's working. He tried again, Telstar, this is 0 Alpha, do you copy? And nothing. And I think the pressure with the convoy getting lost and having to try and work all this out and not having comms with the Bosbok or with the Telstar, he threw the handset at me. And I can remember this thing coming straight for my nose. And luckily, it's on one of those wound up, sort of flexible cables, I suppose you call it, and so it extended and it stopped probably about 5 centimeters from my nose and then sprang back towards it. So yeah, tested the radios again. The guy flew south, the airplane disappeared south. An hour later, came back. This time, when he used the same radio from our side, he got comms, and it turned out that the radio had failed in the aircraft. So yeah, those are the 2 incidences that I can remember off the top of my head, where no comms and a very, very irate officer commanding as a result. So,
well, we have to say it's important to have comms. I mean, that's how the units will talk to each other. But now I might have to ask you, radio discipline. I think anybody who's been in the army, even the police, it's hammered upon. Radio discipline above all. Can you tell us a few words about radio discipline? What do you expect?
Yeah, it's very good that you brought that up, because from a signals point of view, radio discipline and radio security stands second to actually getting effective communications. And when I got up to 3-2 Battalion, we were using that. I mean, they'd been using a coding system which they hadn't changed the codes for 6 months, 8 months. So a message typically, they'd write out the message in English, which for me was the advantage with my bad Afrikaans, because the official language at 3-2 was English. And the reason for that was that if we were operating behind enemy lines and there was Afrikaans being spoken, they would know it's South African, whereas English could come from anywhere. So, which really did suit me very well. So the message would be written out in English, and then every word that, like convoy or aircraft or rations, would be assigned a code, Echo Bravo 10, for argument's sake. And they hadn't changed those for 8 months when I got there. So I changed those. I can't remember whether it was on a daily basis or, yeah, certainly a weekly basis, but still very weak security. to the point where going into Ops Loordfoot, I got there end of 1979. Ops Loordfoot must have been March, April, somewhere there. And we deployed to the west, sort of almost below the cut line, sector 10. And we had a tech HQ at a base called Nkonga, outside of the cut line. We were operating just the other side in southern Angola. And the impression I got manning the TAC HQ and just watching what was happening there was the guerrillas seemed to know exactly who we were, where we were, and where we were going. And there was a guy, commander called Commander Bulanganga was his name, the SWAPO guerrilla. And he out-guerrilled us at every turn in that op. I mean, we could never close with him to make contact and then send in the gunships, which was the standard procedure. Our troops got mortared, the platoons out there. We lost a couple of guys and to the mortar fire, and quite a few of them wounded. And he ran circles around us, and there was something I couldn't put my finger on. So when we went back to Rindu, I went and had a look at all the radio traffic and worked out that before your ops, the amount of communications would spike. That was the first thing. So anybody monitoring our frequencies could immediately be alerted that something was up when the traffic went up. And I changed the coding system. I came up with a system called, I call it SLI code, SLI dash code, which changed every day. And I put in a couple of other disciplines. But at the end of the day, when I presented my report to Commandant Ferreira, at the end of the day, I said to him, whatever we send over HF, no matter what we do with our coding system, is we need to assume that they will break it. And so from that day, everything was, all the sensitive stuff was either one-on-one, somebody get an aircraft and go brief someone, or it was written and put in a sealed top secret envelope and delivered to whoever needed to get it. And so the only information that went over our 3.2 static net from that day on was stock standard resupply that you would normally do for bases. And then so going into Savati, I mean, we didn't use, other than Willem Rutte, doing the reconnaissance for Savati, he used the HF using Morse, very brief, very precise, but that was for a day, and then his radio packed up, it got water in it. And from then, there was no comms on HF, and all VHF. So I'm very confident that from Ops Loordfoot forward, that there were very, very few, there's very little information, if not nothing of any substance, that was given away on our HF, because we went back to one-on-one and nothing on the air. And Savati, I'm confident that the fact that they knew we were coming wasn't from a signals breach. I think it was, they picked up activity, maybe saw the spotter aircraft. And then, mid-year, we got these radios called the hoppers, which were ingenious. And that was just fantastic. And I think maybe we might have been first in the world, or up there with the leading edge, as it were. And basically, a hopper radio is an HF radio where you get communication with the guy on the other side, but you're both in the same HF frequency, say 5.5 megahertz. You both put in a code on your radio. And then one of you, then what they call pulls the other. So in other words, you'd activate something that would pull the other radio in, and they would synchronize, and then they would start hopping across random frequencies while you were talking, and which was amazing. So if you were on a frequency listening out as you normally, and you could hear a hopper go across it to go, you'd hear like a tweet, and that was a radio hopping across multiple frequencies, and yours happened to be one. It's a split second. So the theory of that was that they couldn't follow your conversation. And by then, my approach to it was, yes, this is fantastic, but this doesn't change anything, because I'm guessing with this, but my assumption is that the East Germans at the time and Russians were East Germans, Cubans, and the Russians were, but East Germans mostly with the content, the intelligence and eavesdropping and that, would have a base or even a ship off the coast packed full of computers. And I said, we need to assume that their computers would be monitoring every single HF frequency there was, and would be within a minute or two be able to work out which frequencies you were hopping across. Whether I was correct with that, I don't know. But so huge step forward. But again, we were very, very aware, certainly from my side, with the security. And it only took a huge step forward from that when I went back on my camps about 82, 83 with 2 reconnaissance. And I saw these new, it's called a DET, a data encoding terminal. Basically, they were about this big. It looked like an armored version of a calculator. And there you would type your message in, you'd push encode. This would then scramble it 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, not sure what it would do. And then you would then transmit that scrambled data in bursts over a radio that was hopping across multiple frequencies. So the chances of that being deciphered were very minimal. But by the time that got going, I did my last camp 85. So, but it made huge gains from when I first got to 3.2, where the security was nowhere on the radio, but absolutely critical. Absolutely critical, the security on HF comms, especially.
I have seen wonderful types of aerials being used on these radios. I wonder if you can explain us a few. I mean, I recall those who whiplash around, then were those you throw up into a tree and struggle like hell to get them down again. So, can you tell us a bit about the antennas? Are they crucial to the radio?
Yeah, the antenna is critical. I mean, amongst a few other things, but the antenna is critical, and it had to be a quarter wavelength. And as a non-technical guy, when I got to this one and the theory of the signals training, I battled to understand this. But basically, a wavelength, a frequency, it does this. If that's the middle part, with its curves, as it were, the technical guys will be able to just explain a lot better than I am. But it had a certain length from one point to another, and the antenna had to be a quarter of that length in order for the antenna to resonate sufficiently efficiently enough to transmit your voice or data across the airwaves. And the best way for me to describe it is you take, and the way I understood it for myself, was you take a hose pipe and you cut it 10 meters long, if that's how long the frequency is. You now fill that hose pipe with 10 meters worth of the water. It's going to sit in the hose pipe. So the only way you can get it out of the hose pipe is to cut the hose pipe to 2.5 meters. Then you feed 10 meters worth of water into the hose pipe. It's going to burst out of the hose pipe. So that's from how I got myself to understand the quarter wavelength concept and principle. And that's where, as the signals officer, I used to have sleepless nights, because as much as I made sure that my antennas, I come back to the different antennas, were all quarter wavelength, and whenever you change frequency, you would change the length of the antenna. Where if somebody was out in the field in the platoons or in a small team, 3-4 reconnaissance guys, If they didn't have the correct length of the antenna and there was a comms failure, it was my responsibility. So I used to train them and hammer them with that again and again. And there were also little tricks with it. Your antenna were connected to the radio. If there was a break in a little wire, that could also, and you don't pick that up. So it is as much with the whole of signals with HF of the HF comms. I very quickly worked out there was as much a science as there is an art to effective HF, especially HF communications. And the different antennas, the fixed ones and the HQ, attack HQ, was what we call the dipole antenna, which had a banana in the middle and then 2 quarter wavelength antennas going out either side, cut to the quarter wavelength of the frequency you're using, with a coax cable coming down from the banana branch, which connected it all to the radio. And the dipole had to be at right angles, as it were, to the direction that you wanted to talk. And you could either have the dipole horizontal or you could do it in a V. And that was all about long distance and bouncing your radio waves off the ionosphere to bounce back onto the Earth. And again, the art back then, with the lack of technology, was you never really knew if the HF that you were transmitting was hitting the ionosphere. And they had what was called the skip distance, where you'd push out ground wave, let's say 30, 40 Ks. But then your frequency hitting the ionosphere and coming back to Earth might only hit the back on the Earth's surface at 120 Ks. So between 50 and 120 Ks, no comms. And that would change. Again, as I said earlier, your ground wave depended on whether it was sand or rock, or the water level would affect that. The ionosphere, depending on how high it was or low it was, where it was going to bounce. So there was, I wasn't a technical guy, so you had to have a feel for it. And that was at base out in the field. In 3.2, we used what we call a fish reel antenna, which it looked like a fish reel, but basically the one end of it plugged into the Syncal 30 radio, or B22 as we call it, like a copper fitting. So that was your connection to the radio. And then you would unwind from this, like a fishing reel, the length of a quarter of a wavelength, and you would then throw that into the tree away from the direction you were wanting to make comms. So if you're wanting to talk to someone in the north, you would throw the antenna up into a tree at about 45-degree angles. You would throw it facing south, behind you, and if you're facing north. And again, with that, the antenna that used to wrap around, it was like a piece of string with wire entangled in it, and it was the wire that would resonate for the HF transmission. And after being used too much, the wire could snap in the string, and it was quite hard to see that it had snapped. And of course, that would, no comms. You've got a quarter wavelength facing the right direction, but there's no comms, and you've got to look very carefully in the antenna to find if there is a break there. That was the one thing. And then the other one, the trick was where the antenna came to an end. We used to use the shell casing of a hand grenade, was the easiest one as the weight to throw it into the tree. I got the guys to put a piece of string between the end of the antenna and the grenade casing as the weight, let's say at least 1 meter, or preferably about 2 meters. So when they threw it into the tree early in the morning with the dew sitting or it'd been raining in the tree, if you didn't have the string there before the antenna started, the antenna could be sitting in the tree touching the wet branches, and that would affect your antenna as well. So yeah, the best thing I could do was just to train. Once I'd learned and worked all of this out the hard way, and with the help of the recce guys at the beginning there, I just used to hammer all these basics with the platoon commanders and the corporals and the radio guys in the platoon. So that we also had a rod antenna. And I was in my warehouse and I happened to suddenly realize that here's a rod antenna here, and it folds out, and it's got a cable in the middle, but it obviously folds up so you can put it in your rucksack. And this one happens to be the one. I'm not sure if you can see that there. That was in my rucksack at Savati. That got a bullet hole through the rucksack. And I don't have the radio, unfortunately, but obviously I couldn't take that, but I held on to this. And this was lying alongside the radio, and that's where the AK-47 bullet went through it. And yeah, and that narrowly missed my neck by a couple of centimeters. So that's the rod antenna for the HF. VHF, that had what we call the blade antenna. We had two radios, VHF, an A52 and an A72. The A52 operated on a frequency around about 50, 60 megs, if I remember correctly. The A72, being ground to air, operated around about 140 megahertz, which is more the aviation frequencies. And no surprise that, and then the issue there was with the VHF radio is that it had to be, again, quarter wavelength, even being VHF, a much higher frequency. Remember the HF radio for long distance, we were down at 8 megs, 10 megahertz, and then late at night down to 2.5 sort of megahertz to try and get it to work. So now we're up at 55 odd megahertz for the A52 and 140 megahertz for the A72. And what that means is quarter wavelength, it gets a hell of a lot shorter. And the A52 at the 50 megs and the A72 had a blade antenna. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those here. And those used to, being a blade antenna, you could fold it, but while you were walking, this thing would make a noise. It would like clack, clack, clack. So invariably, and I can quite understand why they did it, the infantry guys would fold it over and tape it with some insulating tape so it wouldn't make a noise. But now, instead of being quarter wavelength, it was less than half, or who knows what length of what it should have been, which drastically affected its ability to make any distance. And VHF, typically in that bush, you could rely a 52 3Ks around about there. Obviously, line of sight, if you're on a hill and you can see the guard directly, you might get 10, 15 kilometers. And then we found, and no surprise, that the A72, the ground-to-air radio, was a lot better than the A52. And I mean, just applying a bit of logic to that, it operated on a much higher frequency at 140 megs. So it's short. The antenna, it was easier to get an effective quarter wave antenna because it was that much shorter at 140 megs as opposed to 50 megs. So we pretty much standardized on the A72 into Platoon and ground to air. They were hard to come by, but a few raids on the signal stores down in Grootfontein and sorted that one out. So yeah, that was the VHF and the antennas.
I can go back a few years. I mean, I'm astonished at your memory, Justin. I mean, we're talking 40, 42 years ago. So I have to congratulate you. But my own father was a signaller. He was called up in the 1950s. I'm not sure exactly when. For a 3-month army or something. It was different in those days. And he became a signaller. And he was very, very proud of that. But he told me something. He was always, I wouldn't say complaining, but he was mentioning the fact that in those days, they had like truck batteries which they ran around with to, give a power to their radios, which obviously were second or stuff. And I've seen also some of the signalers with the signal tents, they have like a light bulb, which is drawing power from a battery. It's hanging there, about 10 of them in a row. And I've often wondered what that's about, because you would ask them and they would just tell you it's too technical for you to understand and go away. So perhaps you can tell us what was this about? Why are those lights hanging there, draining batteries?
Yeah, interesting one. That battery power and the different batteries and how long they would last was critical. One of the key issues that I had to address at TAC HQ, invariably we would have a generator, so we could recharge the big car batteries, and we would have them in parallel or series. I can't remember. But one way it increases the voltage, the other way increases how many amp hours or how much power you've got, or how many hours you can run off it. So I used to have to work out and make sure that we had enough batteries of the big car batteries at the TAC HQs. Obviously, the static HQs, there was electricity, so that wasn't an issue. But the biggest issue was for the HF radios in the field. And we had these NiCad batteries, and they were about that, and they were very heavy. And each platoon, if I remember correctly, would carry two, one on the radio and a spare. We would resupply them every 5 days with food, ammunition, and batteries. But that was a huge, always a major problem for me. The batteries for the VHF radios were disposables that you put in and click, you just peel off, and they weren't that big. But yeah, the biggest thing was the HF. You did have a generator, which you could strap to a tree, and you'd lie on your back and you'd use your legs like riding a bicycle, but on your back with this thing on a tree, and as a generator. But critical was, and again, one of those things that gave me sleepless nights was making sure that the batteries were serviceable. I mean, there were instances where we recharged batteries which didn't hold their charge. They held it enough in the testing, but send it out, and the next day it would fail, within a very short space of time. And that was my responsibility. No matter what, there was no excuse. I just had to make sure that didn't happen. And then again, with the advance of technology, the last camp I did, 85, was the first time I saw solar panels, which you could fold out. And that for me was unbelievable because, before, if you wanted extended communication with power, you had to carry these huge NiCad batteries in your packs. And here with the simple solar panel, you could last indefinitely with just one that was attached to your radio. So that was really, would have been nice to have that in my day. Yeah, and that, just on that front, why the rucksack or mochila that my signaler going into Savati, Bruce Anders, and I, we took turns carrying this thing. And it was so heavy that we couldn't, the only way I could pick it up was putting it against a tree, sit up against it, thread our arms through, roll over onto our chest and push ourselves up. Because we maybe overloaded ourselves a bit with these NiCad batteries, spare radios, but it was the NiCad batteries that was the big one. And so when everyone else didn't have rucksacks going into the assault, he and I were taking turns carrying the dreaded mochila, as we called it at the time. Yeah, but with the battery power came the weight with those back in those days. Today, solar panels, nice and easy. So, let alone a whole host of other technology advances, which, yeah.
It seems they've improved a bit today. It's easier by using satellite. Did you people ever use satellite?
No. I can't even remember if it was available back then, but we certainly didn't do it, didn't use it. And what little that I do know is that I would have thought that satellite and cell phones cellular networks, they are used, but in the military, especially with special forces, there's still your best means of communication and effective and reliable is HF comms. And this, I mean, obviously the radios that they're building today are computerized and think for themselves to a large extent, and especially with the frequency predictions and all that stuff. Amazing. I've seen a little bit of it, but still, military uses HF comms and VHF comms, and I think satellite, I'm guessing a bit, it's the issue there is security, and you're going through someone else's satellite, and maybe even if it's your own, maybe there's a way of eavesdropping on that. So and it's bulky as well, satellite comms, with the antennas in that. So, but makes sense, would be a lot easier. But they're still using HF and VHF radios.
How good were these radios? I mean, were they dust-proof, waterproof up to a point?
There were some that weren't too good. Luckily, the Standard Army used a radio called the B25. I used that maybe for half an hour in training. So not really qualified to too much on that. But the big disadvantage of that was it had an automatic tuning unit. So it would tune the antenna to, you'd get the right length, but it still had to tune, and that would draw a lot of power as a result of that. So it wasn't too popular in the field because of that. With 3-2 Battalion, because we couldn't carry standard kit, we used the British-made Syncal 30, which was a fantastic radio. It was quite big. Obviously not waterproof, as Willem discovered doing the reconnaissance in Savati, but very robust and very reliable. And to tune it, you would manually tune it, and you'd like twirl a knob, and so you could minimize how much power it was drawing from the battery. But very reliable. The VHF sets, those A52 and A72 I speak under correction, but I think those were manufactured in South Africa. And again, very good. Very good radios. And it was just the basics. You had the connections for the handsets, you had to make sure that, inside the connection, maybe the wire hadn't come loose, and little things like that. And the antenna, where it was connected, that something hadn't broken inside. But by and large, it was very reliable equipment that we used. Very simple, very basic, but good. That was good.
I've heard some of the Special Forces men, they were saying when they were operating in Mozambique, and they were part of a Rhodesian SAS, or they were looking like, Rhodesian soldiers at that stage, there was problem with moisture in the air on this English radio you're talking about. And when they used their Morse code pad or whatever, there would be a spark. And he said that really made it very difficult for them to send the correct signal out. But I mean, there's nothing you can do as a signal officer about that. I mean, they just have to figure it out.
Yeah, we didn't use Willem Rutter, the guy headed up our reconnaissance wing. He used to use Morse. But everything else, the platoons were all voice. But Willem would use Morse code. And yeah, I can't remember having that problem. The advantage of Morse is very clear, very precise, and that's why it worked for so long. I think just after World War I. But the dots and dashes, and you don't need very good signal on your communication for the Morse code to actually come through, whereas a voice, it needs a lot clearer communication. So Morse, my standard there was Willem. If they needed the code for responding with everything we had, gunships, Pumas, and even requesting Impala ground strike jets to go in, was Q for Quebec, and which was Here Come the Bride. And Here Comes the Bride. And yeah, one day that did come through from Willem. Late in my year there, I just heard then sort of out of the jumble. Suddenly, I started hearing Q for Quebec, and when I called, nothing in response. So yeah, it was quite hairy, knowing that he was in trouble and not knowing what it was. So passed that on and scrambled. The gunships went out, and we started the process of, if need be, to request the Impala ground strike jets. And Willem and Piet van Eerden and two black guys. There was a 4-man squad. We're doing a reconnaissance in Angola, and two guys midday had walked past. They used to lie up under a bush during the day and then do the reconnaissance at night. And he told us, this signal came through with his Morse, that two guys had walked past them. They didn't think they had been seen, so they were going to stay where they were. But unfortunately, these guys had seen them. And a couple of hours later, I think 50 or 60 of them came back sweeping through. So there was one hell of a firefight. And Willem got hit in the arm, and and I always used to put the radio, that was standard procedure in the bush. You would dig a hole, put the radio in, or put it in a hole, make sure to give it cover. And he had it in an ant bear hole. And he managed to run and dive into the ant bear hole with his bullet through his arm, losing blood. And that's when I first heard there was he'd fainted onto the Morse code key. And then he managed to get the signal through. Piet van Eerden and the two black troops ran off to one side and opened fire on these guys and got them to turn and sweep away from where Willem was lying in the ant hole. And then they ran it up. The black guys ran out of ammunition, so Piet van Eerden told them to run for the border, and Piet van Eerden ran back and dived into the hole with Willem. And by then, he started screaming at me, where's the gunships, ba, 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 bzz, 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 that sort of thing. And yeah, it was difficult trying to keep it cool and to try to assure the guy, look, it's on their way. I mean, what else could I do, you know? And hearing this guy screaming on the radio that he's got 60 guerrillas advancing on two of them and Willem's passed out. So he fought like a tiger, let loose with the claymore mines, which cut down a whole wad of them, anti-personnel mines. And then the gunships got there, they sorted out another whole wad of them. And by then, those that survived disappeared. And we managed to get Willem out, and Piet van Eerden, and the two black guys, I think the next morning, popped up outside of the border. But there was Morse code, very effective. But Willem in 3-2 was the only guy who used it with me here.
Yes, Willem was, of course, Rhodesian SAS before he got to 3-2 battalion, so he would know about Morse code.
Yeah, we were trained with Morse, so but again, yeah, it was easier just to do the voice. But yeah, Morse code, it's quite a thing to learn. But once you get it, people can send Morse faster than people can send SMSs. I've seen a competition recently with that. So very effective with Morse code. Old school, but very effective.
Well, if it works, why change it? But now I have a question. I suppose the command radio post is always manned. So I need to ask you, how far does the authority go to you as the officer commanding that post, that you can go and wake up the commanding officer like Carrera, Falcon, or Echo Victor, or whoever, in the middle of the night, without them getting angry with you? Do you have that authority?
Absolutely. And even if it wasn't me, the signaller on duty, if he got the different priorities, but if it got to, I can't remember, there was a classification where at the top class, there was no doubt they would go and wake them up. So yeah, that was, yeah, that was an easy one. So
Okay, so would you know where these people are? If you get this message through from, say, Palomrata, they're in trouble, would you know on a map where they are? Would they tell you where they are?
Yeah, they would. We would have specific times that they would call in. Platoons generally twice a day, like about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, and then again at about 4. And each one of those, every message, they would give us a grid reference. And what we do for security there on a map in the HQ or TAC HQ, we would have lines going horizontally and vertically. So it's like a grid across the map. And then, so to send, instead of sending a grid reference using latitude and longitude, they would say, our grid reference is Golf Bravo Charlie Alpha, and Golf Bravo would be the one line at the top of the map and Charlie Bravo the other. So when you join the two, you can see where they were on the map. So every communication, we'd get an indication of where they are. But just remembering back in those days, there was no GPS. The terrain we were invariably working in Southwest Africa and southern Angola was very flat and featureless. So yeah, it was very difficult to navigate. We had aerial photographs, which made it somewhat easier, that the guys could at least see, in the platoon commander using the aerial photos could recognize the dry shana or pan, the shape of it. But there was never a guarantee that they were exactly at the position they were telling us. So, which is always a concern. How the Air Force navigated and ever found anybody to this day is a puzzle. I mean, obviously, speed, the old thing with flying, with the speed you're traveling and the time you've traveled on your watch, they would, at that speed, on that bearing, flying for that amount of time, they should be where they are, which is fine unless you've got a tailwind, headwind, or crosswind. Yeah, the Air Force did quite often drop, well, I say quite often, would every now and then drop our guys off at the wrong place, but no surprise. But having said all of that, yeah, everyone, it actually worked, and we would know within a few kilometers where they were invariably. And then as the chopper got closer, let's say whether it was the gunships coming in or the Puma with the resupply or Cassavac, the platoon commander would say, you'd hear the helicopter approaching, and he would call the chopper and say he's throwing a yellow smoke or red smoke grenade, and they'd throw the smoke grenade, and then obviously the chopper would see whether it was to the left or right, and then bank, and that would give them the pinpoint position. But yeah, very interesting with navigating up there pre-GPS. So
yeah, I can just imagine. Now, we had the saying in the police counterinsurgency units that the guy carrying the radio is the most fantastic target. He's shot first. So of course you avoided him as far as possible. But I like carrying the radio because I was from a flying squad and we knew about radio procedures. I mean, we were like controlling entire cities like Pretoria or Johannesburg. All the radios would come through us, and we were not, let me say again, we were not amused if there was any playing on the radios. There were no burping or making strange noises or whatever. Well, it happened, but if we could get hold of you, you will regret meeting us. So we ended up carrying all the radios. Now, you didn't just stay in the command bunker. I mean, you went out on operations. We know you were at Savannah. Would you agree and tell us a bit that a radio signaler might have a more charmed life than a normal guy?
yeah, the normal operations, counterinsurgency in the bush, all 30 odd guys of platoon would be carrying a rucksack, and in one of those rucksack would be the infantryman with the HF radio in the rucksack. So at that point, Under normal circumstances, it would be very difficult. Well, the enemy couldn't pick out the signaler, because while you're walking, you'd use VHF, and the HF set was packed away. So it's not as if you've got a big antenna sticking up while you're walking. It is only every time you stop for a smoke break or whatever, they would put up the antenna for the HF. And the platoon commander and the platoon sergeants, the two of them they'd be carrying VHF radios strapped to their hips with that blade antenna, which if they left it completely extended, would only stick up a little bit above their shoulder. And normally, as I said, they folded them, which gave me gray hair, and taped them up so they wouldn't make a noise. So that the enemy wouldn't have been able to pick out the signaler with the sort of counterinsurgency work and the way we went about it. The only difference was, and how come I ended up with a bullet hole through my rucksack, was at Savati. When we walked in the night before, everybody was carrying their mochilas or rucksack. Just before when they got to a specific spot, everyone dropped their rucksacks, and then went from there on with just the standard assault gear, which is your chest webbing, and you'd have it hanging. You'd have your with a web belt above your web belt, keeping your trousers up, on which you'd have your water bottle, pistol, bayonet, 1 day's ration, 1 day's water, and your chest webbing, and a small medical pouch. But you wouldn't be carrying a rucksack. So the whole idea with that way was that normal operations in the bush, hit contact, you drop the rucksack off your shoulders, and strapped close to your body is everything you need for a firefight. And if you have to run for it, you've got 1 day's water and 1 day's rations and basic medical first aid sort of stuff. So with Savati, everybody dropped their mochilas, except for Bruce Anders and I. We were carrying the dreaded mochila because we had to carry the HF radio into the attack. The platoons didn't have to do that. It was all VHF. So we were the only ones carrying a rucksack, and we went in behind, and very uncharacteristically for an attack HQ, normally they were static and 10, 20 Ks behind the action. We went in with the assault right behind Alpha Company, between Bruce Anders and I, when we first went through the trenches, it was my turn to carry the mochila, short way into the base, we went over the first line of trenches, and then about 30-40 meters in, or maybe a bit more, we took fire from behind us. Everyone dived to the ground, and because of the weight of this thing, if I'd done that, I'd have probably smeared my nose across my face. So I had to kneel first and then put my hand down and then go down. And as I knelt down, I was suddenly pitched face forward and into the sand. And I thought maybe at the time, I'd lost my balance. So I rolled out of it and shouted to Bruce Anders. And that's the one time when rank certainly had its benefits, and said to him, it's now your turn to carry it, which he wasn't happy about at all. And that, for me, that was, it was fantastic, because without that, I could get actively involved in the battle. And poor old Bruce Anders, he soldiered on with the rucksack. And the intelligence captain, Rasmus, he and I, we got separated from the HQ at one point. And I don't remember much about that. Those, whether it was 10 minutes, half an hour, for some reason, we fought for our lives, basically. It was very confusing, and we managed to find the HQ again, the guys, by luck, I think, more than anything. And the OC, I think he was on one hand very relieved to actually see me still alive, but a lot of sharp words about the fact that I hadn't stuck with him, because one of the VHF radios I had, he needed on one of his command nets. But what he didn't realize was how pleased I was to see him. So he could have said anything to me, and it was water off a duck's back. And yeah, and then just as we rejoined the HQ with the platoon that was defending it, we got hit again from the sort of northeast. So everyone dived to the ground, and Bruce Anders afterwards was telling me he managed to get down, but now had this rucksack on him, and the best way to describe it was he was like a tortoise on its back in a shell, and he was struggling to get out of this rucksack with bullets flying, cracking just past his ears, and eventually managed to get out of it, to get on his stomach and come and join the firing line. So yeah, that was clearly when they opened fire on us as we'd gone through, because we all went through the Alpha Company, went through the trenches a bit too quick. We went through the trenches, obviously didn't clear them well enough, and that's why they popped up and attacked us from behind. And I'm very sure that the guy deliberately aimed at me, because I stuck out like a sore thumb. And the bullet hole, if I hadn't happened to lean forward in that instance, when you look at where the bullet came in my rucksack and where it came out, I've still got it, by the way, the rucksack. The bullet missed my neck by this much. So if I hadn't leaned forward, it would have gone straight through my neck. So one of those things when it's not your time, not your time. So yeah, that was probably the only time I'm aware of that. The fact that I was carrying the radio, I stuck out like a sore thumb. The rest of the time, the basic way we operated, yeah, it wasn't a risk to the guy carrying the radio.
Well, as luck as have it, you still have your uniform as well, and we've got a mannequin, which we first saw at the book show. And let's talk about that mannequin. I mean, what happened to you? I'll put a picture of it for everybody to see, of course.
The mannequin, yeah, very interesting how that came about. Because over the years, I used a lot of the kit in my camps as to reconnaissance. But it wasn't like as if I specifically set out to keep all of this stuff. And it was a year or so ago, I was cleaning out storage unit or whatever, and suddenly realized that taking stuff out of a trommel and a balsack, a trommel is a tin trunk and a balsack is one of those duffel bags, and realized that, and I looked at my feet to realize that amongst everything there, everything that I happened to have been wearing at the Battle of Savati, I still had. So I labeled everything, put it into an ammo box and labeled that for my daughters. My eventual demise, they could like open it up and there it is. But then I realized that they wouldn't be able to see the full impact of it all. So they wouldn't know how it all hung together. That's where the idea of the mannequin came in. And I had visions of them opening up a storage unit to be confronted with an armed 3-2 guy at some point. But so I sourced a mannequin. I had to rework the arms with fiberglass and foam so that it could hold an R1. And I sourced a fiberglass R1, plastic 9mm pistol, plastic hand grenades, and then, yeah, put the mannequin together. And quite an interesting process, because I mean, from head to toe on that mannequin is exactly what I had at the Battle of Savati in 1980, from the cap to the rucksack to the first line webbing, the chest webbing with my R1 stroke FN 7.62 magazines, the pistol holster, the camouflage shirt and trousers, and the boots that we wore. So yeah, it's classic. And I think the relevance, aside from a personal aspect with my daughters, is that when I look at that mannequin, it's classic 3-2 cross-border operation kit, and nothing like the normal South African Army. So they wore brown nutria, leather boots, and whereas our boots had canvas sides and soft rubber soles without an imprint underneath, so that left minimal spur. But very unique and very distinct to 3-2, those canvas-sided boots. I was always very proud to wear those, aside obviously from the beret. And then, yeah, the combat, then the shirt and trousers were the distinctive 3-2 external operating kit, and with mine, the shirt has still got the bullet holes in the side, and my left arm, where later in the day in the Battle of Savati, a bullet ricocheted off the side of a buffel that I was sitting in. Very, very lucky that it hit the very top edge of the buffel, and some of it tumbled outside, and the rest came inside. And so I was very lucky. And exactly where that bullet came from still remains a bit of a mystery. But so the shirt is there with a hole, the rucksack mochila with this bullet hole going through, is there, and here the antenna is with the disfiguring from that bullet. Still got that. Yeah, and the rest of it, we have these funny Portuguese caps, Portuguese army style, which I always thought were, very impractical in terms of sheltering you from the sun, but very unique to 3-2. Again, so quite proud of that, even though I think they look a bit silly. But that one was the one I was wearing. I put Black is Beautiful on the mannequin's face. And we had to wear Black is Beautiful, the white guys, because if we didn't do that, we would stick out like sore thumbs amongst our black troops. And as you will see in the photo, I think it comes through quite nicely. It was never very pretty when you got up close to see that something was very wrong with this person's face, because you could see bits of white skin sticking out around the eyes and the nose and the ears. Black is Beautiful in your face and your hands. We keep our sleeves rolled down. And also the chest webbing that was unique 3-2 up to then. Most of the troops, I think Special Forces might have had chest webbing, but normal infantry used to keep their ammunition in pouches on their belts, their spare magazines. So we had chest webbing across our chest. And once you'd thrown the rucksack off, as I mentioned, you had your first line webbing, which was you'd strap over your shoulder and put a web belt across your stomach, and chest webbing around your chest. And then hanging off the web belt around your stomach, as it were, would be a pistol, 9mm for backup to your assault rifle, one water bottle for one day's water. You'd have another pouch with a day's rations or emergency to keep you going for a day. Another pouch with basic medical, especially I think it was Sosagon, to inject yourself for shock if you got hit, and spare and grenades. So that's all you would have. So it was very close to your body. It didn't rattle. You're able to move and very effectively get involved in the fight with that. And all of that is there. Exactly what I was wearing by chance after all these years. It's still, so quite fun putting it together, but interesting standing back and looking at it after all these years. So,
and I'm very glad you did that, because for the first time we can actually visualize exactly what you're talking about. That's fantastic. But can you remember, Justin, when you were awarded your special beret, the camouflage beret of 3-2 Battalion? Because I have to say that's unique. There is no other unit in the South African Defence Force that have the same beret.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question, because yeah, it was I was a letdown. But when I got to 3-2, when I arrived there, I remember the sort of walked into the ops, not in the ops room, but next to it, and introduced myself. I'm the new signals officer, and I can't remember who it was, a major or whatever, said, "Oh, okay, cool, welcome, and there's your desk," and you walked off. And that was it. So I sat down and sort of looked around and thought, well, now what? It wasn't like there wasn't, I was like on go and meet the OC and the big thing. And so I sat there and went to introduce myself to the signalers. And I sat around for a couple of days, in fact, with my signals beret. And it was about after a week that Dion Ferreira finally had the time to see me. So went on orders into his air-conditioned office, and he welcomed me, and the whole time he had this little smile on his face. I kept thinking, what's the little smile? And I think he just maybe knew what I was in for. And there's this raw recruit, full of enthusiasm and naive and innocent about all of this. And so, yeah, he said, welcome, and shook my hand, and off I went. And so, yeah, I was in that second week, went to issue me with a rifle and some of the kit. And with all of that, oh, by the way, here's your beret. And I thought, well, that's very nice. So put the beret on, and the only thing different was what we call the bulky. There's the buffalo badge, and beneath it is the signals bulky. So whereas the infantry guys had their infantry and intelligence, their bulky. So you could, and that was it. So that's how I got my my 3-2 beret. So initially I was very apprehensive. I wouldn't say apprehensive. I felt awkward wearing my beret. I felt I hadn't earned it. Whereas I felt I would have gone through more of a process. If I'd got there earlier, hopefully I could have done the selection course with Rick that he mentioned, and the rest of the infantry guys. I'd have loved to have done that. So yeah, it took a while for me. Once I'd gone on a few ops and cut my teeth, it took a while for me to feel that I really had earned the right to wear this beret and to wear the 3-2 canvas boots. The canvas boots was after cross-border ops. Yeah, so it took a while. And based on that, when I first got there, I was every 2 or 3 months, I would get new campers, which is the civilian force guys called up for a camp. I had to retrain these guys as they arrived. The discipline wasn't too good. Yeah, their mind was obviously back home because they were up there temporary. And that's why I insisted with Dion Ferreira, the OC, that at the end of the year, we had to get national service permanent, who would be with the unit for at least a year, if not longer. And so end of my time there, we received, I think, a batch of 12 signalers. And I made a point of taking them out to the recce base and putting them through what I called so quite dramatically, I suppose, a 3-2 battalion combat signals course. I think they're probably the most overtrained signalers on the border at the time, if not ever. But as we put them through, we with the recce guys, we took them into the bush. We gave them basically minor combination of the special forces stuff, minor tactics, and special forces platoon weapons. Minor tactics is basically do's and don'ts in the bush. Like if there's a fly buzzing around your head, you don't do this because that movement will be picked up very quickly. So you have to do one of these. If you're going to go for a pee up against a tree so it doesn't make a noise. Lots of other little things. And how to the basics in the bush of do's and don'ts. We taught them a bit of that. We introduced them to the full range of weaponry, all the NATO, all our weapons, all the Russian the PKM, RPD, AK-47, heavy barreled AK. But it was just great fun from our side and all of us. And the recce guys, they really got into it. So, and we had them firing live rounds and doing a firing movement. I took them on a security patrol. At one point, when we were in a bit of a dip, we had machine gun fire open up over us over there, so they could hear what it sounded like. So these guys were properly trained and very ready to get involved if they got into a situation like I did a few times, and especially Savati. And then a week or two of very practical, redone all the theory, and I'd simplified the manual for them on the key points, and then focus very much on the practical side of communications. And then at the end, blindfolded them. We took them out into the bush, dropped them off, and they had to work out where they were. And we put them into 4-man teams, 4 or 5-man teams, and they had to work out where they were, find their way back over 2 nights, I think it was. All the time, they obviously had to have comms, make comms, or else there's be a problem for them. And I took a bit of a risk with that because outside of Mahoney, it wasn't a particularly hot area, but it was in the operational area. And one of them actually, the sticks actually radioed back and said, we picked up Chevron guerrilla spoor. And I was sort of 2 miles about it. On the one hand, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. If one of my signals stick of 5 guys manages to bag a few guerrillas, they might promote me to general or whatever. But flip side of it, one of my guys was killed. I'd probably have been court-martialed. So, but it turned out it was very stale, and so yeah, there was no point in following up. The point I'm leading up with all of this to is at the end of that, those guys who made that combat signals course that I put them through with infantry, with a bit of special forces stuff thrown in, the infantry training, the bush anti-guerrilla signals training, they earned the right to wear a 3-2 beret with the signals bulky. And when we got back to Rundu, I had a parade, sort of one of those typical special forces parades where it's not the snappy stuff on a parade ground, but they were all formed up outside the HQ. And with the regimental, our Sergeant Major Ikuman was doing the discipline stuff, and Corner and Ferreira awarded each one of them, shook their hands, their 3-2 beret. So I made sure that they got to earn it and made to feel that they had earned that right. Whereas I suppose I had to get out there and earn it with a bit of time and getting involved in the real stuff. Yeah, so that's my 3-2 beret.
Well, I've heard about you before. When we spoke to Peter Lipman, who I believe is a friend of yours, he said to me he was on a camp and he was standing guard or searching vehicles or something. He was now with a different unit, not at 3-2 anymore. And you arrived and you sort of rescued him from that horrible job of standing guard and took him with you to 2 recce where you were doing a camp. So may I ask you, for the time after you left 3-2 Battalion, now you're back in South Africa, which in those days were fairly still under apartheid. And in 3-2 Battalion, there were no apartheid whatsoever because black, white, all soldiers doing a job, men of men. Can you take us through that period and how did you end up in 2 recce, and what is 2 recce anyway?
2 Reconnaissance was the Citizen Force Reconnaissance Regiment. And you had 1 Reconnaissance, which was where it started with the reconnaissance guys. And best way to describe that, I think they were airborne reconnaissance as a differentiator. The 2 Reconnaissance, which was a civilian force. 3 Reconnaissance, I had a brief, I think the ex-Rhodesians might have come in, but that didn't work or whatever. So 3 never really was anything that I knew of. 4 reconnaissance were seaborne reconnaissance guys at Lagaban, and they obviously parachute trained, but there was scuba diving, and they did most of their ops coming in through submarines, dropping them off on the Angolan coast or Mozambique coast. So there was 4 reconnaissance, and then 5 recce were based out in Pelaboa. And the part of 5 recce I was involved in with some of my camps was based up in on the big, there was the big Air Force base at Grootfontein, then Ondangwa Shikari, and never remember which one was the Air Force base or Army base. They had Fort Rev, I think it was. There was Fort Doppies in the Caprivi, where we did some training. There was Fort Foot or Fort Rev in Rundu, and Fort Foot or Fort Rev in Ondangwa, the Air Force base. And I did 2 or 3 camps with them, which is a month, 2 months. And that section of 5 recce were pretty much our version of Zulu Scouts. And that was very interesting. I can't remember what the incentive was when they captured guerrillas, what it was that they proposed to them, that they switch sides and I actively hunt down their past comrades. But there was some way that they would incentivize that. And I remember the first time I got there, standing on the parade ground every Friday, there'd be one of the typical Special Forces parades. You're all standing there and you come to attention, but it's all quite relaxed sort of thing. And there were 8 white guys on one end, and I remember looking down to the rest of them, 70, 80 of them, and suddenly it struck me that I was standing there with 80 ex-guerrillas, which is quite interesting. So, yeah, in my time with 2 recce, I was pretty much based in that fort, I think it was Fort Rev, and just supporting the signal structure. They were already very organized. I went in a couple of TAC HQs in support of small teams, 4 or 5 that were out there. And the one time they made contact with their ex-comrades, the problem was it was just as the sun was coming up, and they couldn't get comms with HF, so they lost the initiative. And I think there was a bit of a firefight out there, and then they had to run like hell, the 5 recce guys, whereas they were waiting for if the comms had worked when it should have, the gunships would have got there, and we could have bagged some of the guerrillas. But and yeah, 10 minutes later, suddenly they came through clear as a whistle. But whether it was something with their radio, the antenna, but of course, as a signals officer, my responsibility. So that was. Yeah, and we very interestingly, the one flight went in with a chopper to drop 2 guys off north of Anjiva, 1 white guy and 1 black guy. And I can't remember how far we refueled the Puma at Anjiva, and then flew a good hour or so easy straight north, dropped these guys in the middle of the bush, middle of nowhere. The chopper came down through the trees, had to actually reverse back with the engineer telling the pilot, Terry Chaplin, what to do, to come down, and then reverse to put it down. These 2 guys jumped off with these huge rucksacks and disappeared into the bush. And then he had to take off, go forward and up through the trees, and then back to, I can't remember if we refueled back again with Anjiva. So that was very interesting, and supporting these guys. So, and one of the previous conversations you asked me, was there anything that you're involved in of any note? And the one incident was when I was in the fort, I'm sure it was Fort Rev. They'd thrown 2 of their troops who had been turfed them out of 5 recce and let them loose out there, which the humane thing to do. But if you just think of it in the bigger context, you would have thought they would have put them in a camp forever and a day or whatever. But these two guys went back into the bush, joined up with their ex-guerrilla mates, and then came back to the Air Force Base. And the two guys who they'd thrown out got under the perimeter fence of the Air Force Base, crossed the 10 meters or so to the embankment with the barbed wire, and were busy tunneling their way under the barbed wire to get into Five-Riki Special Forces Base. And this was middle of the night, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. I was asleep in the one, there was a bungalow for the major. Then the next two were officers, and I was in the first one of those. And when you opened the door, I was in that first bed. So I'll come back to why I'm mentioning it. But fortunately, the security guys in the watchtower for the Air Force Base with their night vision glasses picked up that saw these guys. They've on the little wind-up telephone got hold of the signal on duty and said to him, "Listen, there are two guys trying to get into your base. Is it one of your guys?" Because the special forces are always up to different things. And the signaller said, "Well, hold on, I'm going to have a look." So it was just a pair of shorts and a pair of slip-slops, no rifle. He ambled off down to that corner of the base, looked around, couldn't see anything, came back to him and said, the telephone, "Yeah, no worries, don't worry about it. There's nothing there." So fortunately, the lieutenant involved didn't take that and stop. He went with 5 or 8 guys with the gun, machine gun up in the tower as backup. And they challenged these guys, and this whole firefight erupted. These two guys ran back under the perimeter fence, and the rest of their guerrillas were other side waiting to come in once they'd channeled it and sorted everything out to get into the Special Forces Base to sort us out. And so this whole firefight erupted with 81mm mortars firing their patterns of the machine guns from the towers. One hell of a thing. And all the guys jumped out and were shooting from the bunkers. The next morning, I woke up, and so everyone was buzzing around, and there's like this whole buzz. I said, "What's up?" And they said, "Well, what do you mean, what's up?" I said, "No, I'd slept through the whole thing." And so my daughters, when I tell them the story, they love it because they pull my leg to say I slept through the whole war, because I fell asleep during the Battle of Savati. I fell asleep through an attack on the Special Forces Base. So that was about it with Tureki. A bit disappointing because you can never, being a camper, you're there for a month, 2 months max. You never really felt part of it. You couldn't really get going and do anything of consequence and deliver it. So I just kept to the basics and the support and did my camp and then went back to university. So, but that was very interesting working with the Special Forces guys. Very different, highly trained, and very different psychological makeup. Obviously, to do what they do, a lot of respect for them. And out of that process, I often say to guys, people say to me, "Oh, they went for selection and they failed." And for me, I always say you didn't fail. There's to be a Special Forces soldier or anything else, even an accountant, you have to have a specific character and physical ability and mental, but some people you either cut out for it or you aren't. So for me, it's not a question of failing the selection, because they would look for the guys who would naturally be able to handle this mentally and physically. And they were very different, those Special Forces guys. So very interesting working with them.
Okay, so after you finished the camps, you went on with your life, you became a businessman, you speak about your daughters quite a lot. So tell me, did you have any problems getting back into civilian life? Did it feel strange to you? Do you regret anything in the army?
Yeah, very good question, because it's been a very interesting journey for me. Coming out of the military, especially after 3-2, coming back to apartheid, living in apartheid South Africa. I came in 1980, so it was pretty much the height of apartheid. Having been in a combat unit which knew there was no racial differentiation at all. It was about not about the color of a man's skin, but what he was capable of and what you had to contribute. It was very difficult, not only from that perspective, but also the operations we were involved in with 3-2 were all top secret, clandestine missions, so we're not allowed to talk about it anyway. And then there was, the combat issues or your mates that that didn't make it that you had to deal with, and you couldn't talk about any of this to anybody. You just had to get on with it. And I mean, from a psychological point of view, with trauma, that sort of stuff, the best is to be able to talk about it, to get out of your system, see it in a better perspective. But we had that all locked up in us. And also there was a bit of the Vietnam syndrome, getting back, I call it the Vietnam syndrome, where the guys of Vietnam were fighting an unpopular war. They get back to the US. And instead of being I wouldn't say heroes, but I mean, being credited with what they were doing for their country, it was the opposite. People, part of the population in America was very anti and would actually, do some, wouldn't give them the credit that they were due. And we had a bit of that coming back as well, because it was confusing times, apartheid. Was it right? Was it wrong? What was the alternative solution? Who knew? So it was very difficult. And for 10 years, I could never talk about it without getting, or sort of think if I managed to talk about something to someone, I'd get a sort of uneasy feeling for a couple of days in my gut. Funny enough, it was, I'm not an avid hunter, but getting out there and hunting, again, it just somehow helped me find a bit of closure. Just that whole issue with hunting, we're taking the responsibility of taking a life, in some way, helped me sort of find a bit of closure and a bit of perspective. And the biggest thing was that really got me was I didn't feel I could be particularly proud of what I'd done because of all of this apartheid stuff and the rest of the world being against us, and the very confusing time if I look back on it. And even then, very relieved with 1994. For me, when 1994 happened, I actually felt as if, and 3-2 was disbanded just before that, it was almost for me, almost as if the baton that 3-2 had carried when it came to racial integration or had been passed on to the country. And so that was a hell of a thing for me, because at last, our day-to-day lives was based on what was fair. And we were always, I suppose, back in the day, terrified that with the threat of communism and being persecuted and happened what other countries in Africa. That didn't happen in South Africa. It's got its problems now and had its problems, sure, but the principle, the rights of any individual are the same. And and it was after that I met a guy at Day Scales, Sergeant Major Day Scales, who was SAS Salute Scouts and Fire Reconnaissance Career Soldier. And he helped me, without specifically going about it, but I mean, this whole attitude, he helped me regain my pride with what it was that we did, what we achieved, what we contributed. So also being part of the 3-2 VA Veterans Association, it's always been hugely emotional, but going to the Savati reunions has helped me quite a lot. talking to guys and seeing we're all going through the same, very similar PTSD type things, I suppose. But yeah, we've had to figure it out for ourselves, get on with it. And even after all these years, 40 years later, the fact I'm talking to you about it, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do this 20 years ago, that's for sure. So, but the emotions will always be there. It's very difficult to understand why. I mean, small thing will just trigger something, and I'll just feel it welling up. So, yeah, it'll live with me forever. But end of the day, I'm very, very proud of what it was that I did. I believe that all of us who were involved in the military can be very proud of our contribution, because it kept the pressure off our borders and allowed the situation internally, politically, to develop. Yeah, 1994 for me was a miracle, because that it turned out the way it did without bloodshed. Prior to that, the way I saw it, it was either we get taken over by communism or there'd be a huge civil war. So it was amazing that it turned out the way it did. And but yeah, long process. It'll live with us, all of us who were there forever. But we've had to learn to deal with it, get on with it, see it in perspective, and live our lives. Yeah, and get on with it.
No, that's really true. And I think sometimes as South Africans, we forget that. The army, the defense force, the security forces did buy time. And then came a peaceful, negotiated settlements from which Mr. Mandela came. But you also wrote a book. I mean, you're not just somebody, you're actually an author. Can you tell us quickly about your book? And I want to say to people, if you want to know more about the book, there will be links in the description as well. And you can go to Legacy Books, where Justin, I think, talked to us for about an hour about his book. But can you just briefly, for those who don't know, tell us about your book?
Yeah, sure. I think the interesting thing with the book is that I never set out to write my story, let alone publish it. Thanks to Pete Nokia, who wrote quite a few books on 3-2 Battalion. He insisted I write my account of Savati. Of 5 HQ officers who went into the day, 2 of us survived the battle, Commandant Ferreira and myself. He since died of natural causes, so I'm the only guy left alive. He was an HQ officer in that battle. So yeah, so it was, I didn't want to relive all of that. And so he really had to badger me to get it done. Eventually, I thought I'd better get it done before. He's got a point from a historical point of perspective. And while I was at it, I thought for my daughters, who I thought I'd like them to read whatever it is that I'm writing. So they were are my audience with the book. So the whole story was pitched at them, and I initially wrote about arriving in 3-2, and nearly got thrown out by Deon Ferreira with the comms failure, through to Savati in the middle, and then at the end, Deon Ferreira wanted me to stay. He then came to visit me once I'd sent it off to him and said, "What are you doing with the story?" And I said, "Well, you've got the history part for Savati, and the rest is for daughters or anyone who might be interested." And he said, "Can I send it to my publishers in London, Helion?" And I said, "No, you can't, because it's a very personal story. And because my daughters were my audience, I try to be as frank and truthful about what I thought and my fears and all that sort of stuff. So laid bare my soul." So I was very apprehensive about putting that out there. But then Helion, Veshi, I said, "Okay, we'll send it to Helion," and I didn't think they would, come of it. They liked it, and again, they had to. I was very reticent, but yeah, they eventually published it in 2013, and I've since republished it as an independent author last year. Very appreciative when I look back of the fact that it was published, that Pietnook, just the whole process of Pietnook here, Helian, and really pushing me. I'd never have written the story and never have published it without them pushing. But very appreciative. The fact that they did, been an interesting journey. And with it all, the easy part, initial publication was with Helian. Once I'd published it, and I'd sent everything off, I took the back seat, left them to do what they needed to do. So no book launches, any of that sort of stuff. Yeah, very apprehensive with making too much of a song and dance of it. So yeah, but encouragingly, the feedback that I've got, I was hoping that people would be able to read it and see it for what it is or was, and see the reality, understand a bit better that era that we were in the 70s and the 80s of the apartheid and the military and where it all ended up and how we were involved, and learn something on a personal nature too about warfare, that sort of thing. And the feedback I've had has been very encouraging and positive. So from that perspective, it's been very well worthwhile. But quite a daunting prospect and quite a daunting journey, I suppose. But yeah, there it is. It's out there, and I just hope that people will appreciate it and learn something from it and see that era in a better perspective, or a deeper perspective, as to what we were faced with, what we went through, what the issues were. So
thank you. We appreciate that. Well, Internet, we come to the end of a fascinating episode. Justin, thank you. Really appreciate it. But we have a bonus for you. We were talking, and he started telling me about his granddad and his father, both fighter pilots. Dad later flew the Dakotas, C-47, DC-3. I believe you're a pilot yourself, Justin.
Yes, but private pilot. So the only way I can claim to be a fighter pilot is most times that I'm trying to fly straight and level, I'm fighting the controls just to do that. So that's the closest I get to that.
Well, that's fantastic nonetheless. So what we have here for you as a bonus, there will be a little talk where, not long, where Justin is telling us about his granddad as well as his dad and their careers during the First and Second World War. I want to say to all of you here, you are not unimportant. Don't let somebody break you down. Don't let somebody tell you you were just nothing. Come and talk to us. If you have any type of story, if you think you have a story, man, you've got a story. Otherwise, you wouldn't be thinking it. Just come and talk to me, contact me, and we will gladly speak to you and will gladly preserve your story for the grandkids and those who's following us, because it might mean something to somebody. You just don't know. You would be surprised how many letters we get from the viewers where they say, man, I've listened to this guy. I feel so good now because I thought I was the only one and I'm not the only one. And now I feel, you know what, you can actually see the pride coming back to these people. And that's fascinating. It's fantastic for me to see. So if you have a story, please come and talk to me. Open invitation. I don't care what rank you had. I don't care what unit you were in. I don't even care whether you were involved in a border war or not. Just come and talk to me. And until we meet again, God bless.
I've got my grandfather was a fighter pilot in World War One. I'm very proud of both of them. He earned the Military Cross. Oh. Yeah, how he survived, Lord only knows how he survived. He trained in mid-1916, volunteered for the Royal Flying Corps, which became the RAF, end of the war. Yes. and did their training on an FE-8, which is a biplane, but the engine at the back, set at the front with the Lewis gun, which they hadn't worked out to strap the Lewis gun to the airplane and aim the airplane. The Lewis gun was on a bipod, and 18 of them flew across the channel to France. So they got there and got to their forward base. Must be about October. By April of the next year, he was one of 2 of the 18 left alive. He survived through to the end of 1917 before getting shipped back to the UK to be, one hell of an honor, to be part of the first fighter school that was set up in a town called Ayr in, I think it's certainly Scotland, but I think it's on the northwestern side of Scotland. Training guys to do, they call it stunting instead of aerobatics. And that was the last bit of when pilots had done their basic training. They'd go to Ayr and get trained by my grandfather and the other ace of aces that were there, McCudden, all those guys who'd had 40, 45, 50 kills. My grandfather, inverted commas, only shot down 3, so he wasn't an ace, but obviously he was ranked as one of the better pilots in the Royal Flying Corps to be training them the last leg. And his military cross, he earned that, the citation, he earned that mid-1917, middle of that year he was there. His determination and dash in engaging hostile bodies of enemy troops at low altitude, enemy troops and machine gun nests at low altitude has been most marked. I mean, you just picture this guy in this airplane flying at 80 miles an hour, which is like almost a walking pace up there, and attacking those trenches with those Spandau machine guns with their rate of fire. And I've since sourced some of the combat records written by him. They at the War Museum, the place in London where they've got all the stuff. And they were outclassed from the start with the FE-8s. The Albatross flew faster, climbed faster, twin Spandau. I think they had twin Spandaus, I think it was, but 2 machine guns firing through the prop. And he had a Lewis gun with a 70-round magazine. And the combat reports that I've read of January, February, the Germans were running away from him because they were so aggressive. And so that's my grandfather. Yeah, very proud of him. And there's a hell of a story there. And my father flew Hurricanes in North Africa, tank busting. They called it S-gunning. They got, I think it was a 40 millimeter cannon, 1 or 2 of them strapped to the Hurricane. And it was the only cannon that could actually penetrate the German armor. And he did that and convoy support. They then converted to Spitfires, and he was then sent his squadron to an island called Kos in the Aegean. And it was one of, they call it Churchill's follies, where they were completely outgunned, and it was a crazy idea. And they landed at Kos, and it was within a month his squadron was decimated. And the last fight, basically 40 enemy aircraft with Me-109s, fighter bombers came in to bomb the runway. There were only 3 serviceable Spitfires left. My father flew one of those, and these guys took off up against these guys, and one guy was shot down, just managed to regain control, crash landed on the airfield. My old man was the second to go. Bailed out at 28,000 odd feet. Didn't realize how high he was. The aircraft was on fire. And he landed in the sea. The last guy, Rovik, he got shot. He was killed. They just shot him to pieces. And luckily, a fishing boat saw my father land in the sea, and he was a bit burnt, and he badly injured his leg, might have broken it, getting out. And only half got into his little dinghy, and the fishing boat fetched him, took him back to Kos, and back to the hospital or medic tent that they had at the airfield. And a few days later, German paratroopers landed on the other side of the runway, and everyone had decided to get out of there. And a sergeant came back in a jeep to check, and everyone had been evacuated. And my old man was standing in this tent, looking around, wondering where everybody was, not realizing what's happening with his leg bandaged. So he bailed him into the jeep. They went down to the harbor, commandeered a boat that had come in from Turkey that was full of watermelons, and rode off trying to get to Turkey. There were, I think, 5 or 6 of them in there. And luckily, they turfed some of the watermelons out so they could make room for them. And they nearly got shot up by their own bow fighters, as well as the Luftwaffe. So it was quite tense, and they survived on the watermelons, made it to Turkey, and then from there made their way through Turkey, walking and getting lifts on freighters that hugged the coast, and eventually got back to North Africa. So that was my father, and yeah, he's also got 2.5, 3 kills to his name, as it were, same as his father, my grandfather. So, and then he went on to fly Dakotas, thousands of hours, ferrying troops from South Africa to North Africa. Then ended his career flying Berlin Airlift, 1948, a Dakota going in and out of Berlin. So that's, yeah, very proud of them.
Was he flying your dad? Was he flying for SAF or for RAF?
For the SAF, after the war, I think with the Berlin Airlift, he was seconded to the RAF, but he was SAF, South African Air Force, during the war, with the Hurricanes and Spitfires, of course, yeah.
Can you tell us about the Berlin Airlift? Because there might be youngsters here who perhaps don't remember one of the greatest feats of airmanship ever.
Yeah, Berlin Airlift, from what little I know of it, it was 1948. The war came to an end in 1945, Second World War, and the Russians had gone, and when they invaded Germany, they went through Berlin and came west of Berlin before they met up with the Allies. So Berlin was actually in the Russian-occupied part of Germany. And with the advent of the Cold War, the Russians decided to cut off the supplies that were coming from West Germany through the Russian border into East Germany, and then traveling, I'm guessing a bit, let's say it was 80, 100 Ks into Russian-controlled Germany, which was Berlin. And they stopped any supplies going in by road. So the Allies got together and they flew in the supplies that Berlin needed. And Berlin itself was divided into 4 sectors: Russian, French, US, and British. So the French, British, and US sectors were West Berlin. East Berlin was the Russian sector. And every 4 minutes, I think an aircraft, mostly Dakotas, DC-3s, were taking off and landing with coal and all the basics. And they had specific corridors to fly in, fly down. And if they strayed out of that, the Russian yaks would threaten to shoot them down. So the navigation had to be spot on at night in bad weather. And my father was one of, I think it was about 18 South African Air Force pilots who were sent to fly, and in the process, they were seconded to the RAF for that. So it was an amazing feat, the fact that they were able to keep West Berlin supplied with all the basics they needed by air. Yeah, I think the Russians eventually gave up with trying to, they thought that they could then control the whole of Berlin. They eventually gave up, and I speak under correction, but I think went back to allowing supplies to come through on convoys on the ground.
Yes, that's as good a summary as I could give myself. I mean, the Soviet Union really thought they're going to conquer Berlin, take it over. People would give up. And then came this air breach It is fantastic. I understand. I read in the newspapers the other day that one of the pilots, as he would come in, he would drop little parachutes filled with sweets and things. Now, please remember, this is 3 years after the war ended. Europe was gone. It was totally destroyed in the fighting. People were hungry. They didn't even know what sugar is. And so he would drop these little parachutes for the kids. I think I called him a candy bomber. But he passed away about a week or 2 weeks ago. So it is really nice for me to hear about somebody whose dad was actually at that. I would call it the first victory of the West over the Soviet Union. Especially when they stopped this idea in its track. Now that's fantastic.